Much like the Graham family's matriarch Ellen Lee, Hereditary as a film holds many secrets, and it's only upon further inspection that viewers can recognize all the intricate details and decipher its hidden meanings. In Hereditary, writer-director Ari Aster explores the deep psychological trauma of Annie Lee from her mother and how this trauma is passed along to and affects the rest of her family. The entire film, you're wondering what exactly is going on, and it's not until the final few moments that everything clicks. In the closing scene, we learn that the whole movie has been a meticulously planned ritual shepherded by the late Ellen Lee. The goal of this ritual being to transfer the spirit of a demon known as King Payman from the body of Annie's daughter, Charlie, into the male body of her son, Peter. I've recently read Ari Aster's original screenplay for the film and found a ton of intriguing ideas that were either cut for time or made less explicit to maintain a degree of mystery. Now, without further ado, let's begin. In Aster's original screenplay, there is a brief but interesting scene at the beginning of Ellen's funeral before Annie speaks at the podium, where an old friend of Ellen is talking about how she hated being sentimental and how honest she always was. Her speech is interrupted, however, by the emergence of a bird from the rafters. It flies around for a moment, startling everyone, but ultimately just lands elsewhere in the room, and causes no serious issues. This is an occurrence that even the characters think was odd. On the car ride home from the service, Annie reflects on the strangeness, saying, "That was too weird. The timing? It felt like it was my mom." It's important to note that the bird appears right after the mention of Annie's brother Charles, who we later find out committed suicide because he believed Ellen was trying to put people inside him. Now, I would say this is the same bird that slams its head into the window outside of Charlie's classroom, but the script explicitly differentiates the species of bird, the one at the funeral being a whippoorwill, and the one at the school being a pigeon. It is possible that the bird at the beginning was the spirit of Ellen, but that would go against the idea of spirits requiring beheadings to escape the body. However, the pigeon that smashes its head into the window could possibly be the spirit of Ellen trying to get Charlie's attention. The fact that Charlie beheads the pigeon only enforces this idea, as she might be trying to free her grandmother. When the Grahams arrive home from the funeral, both in the script and in the film, there are frantic footsteps heard upstairs moments before the family enters the house. However, in the script, the father, Steve, makes note of dried footprints around the entryway and believes it's because Peter and Charlie walk around the house wearing their shoes. This makes it more apparent that the payment cult has been consistently invading the Grahams' home to help guide things along. In this instance specifically, it's possible that they are carving the triangle in Ellen's room that Annie finds later, indicating the northwest. But that case can only be made for the final film, because when Annie enters the room in the script, Aster goes out of his way to note that the triangle has been there for a period of time. The direction of the triangle is important because in occultist Johann Weyer's False Monarchy of Demons, Weyers writes, "Note that at the calling up of Payman, the exorcist must look toward the northwest, because there is his house." And at the end of the film, once the invocation ritual is complete, Joan mentions that the cult has summoned Payman from the northwest. Also in the screenplay, Charlie has a little shoebox into which she places her collection of animal heads. There is already a rat and a cat head in there before she adds the pigeons to the collection, which is extremely disturbing. But this also foreshadows the 3 beheadings that will later take place in the film: Annie, Ellen, and Charlie. Steve's corpse is also beheaded, but considering he's a Graham and not a Lee, I think this was more symbolic than ritualistic. Following Charlie's death, Steve finds the drawings of these animals in Charlie's sketchbook, and Peter finds the shoebox at the base of the treehouse. In this moment, we can hear flies swarming around from within, which parallels the flies in the attic that swarm around Ellen's corpse. Later, we also see the rat and pigeon head in Joan's apartment, along with the head of a squirrel, all bowing before a raven-headed figurine. A bit later, Charlie is walking out barefoot into the woods, following the glint of light that represents some form of Payman's disembodied consciousness, or an energy force he uses to guide the family members to do his bidding. In the script, there is snow covering the ground, so the footprints Charlie is following are a bit more apparent. In the film, what Charlie sees is a bit ambiguous. It is seemingly her grandmother Ellen sitting in the woods, surrounded by fire. When I first saw the film, I assumed this figure was an apparition, like the one Annie sees earlier. Mostly because I missed the trail of footprints Charlie was following, but also because Annie doesn't see the figure at all. Yet in this version of the script, the figure seems to be the real dead body of Ellen Lee, with the body standing erect in a similar configuration to how Charlie's statue stands at the end of the film, or even the elders in Midsommar. Now, the confirmation that Ellen's body was transferred to the Grahams' house almost immediately after the desecration of her grave recontextualizes a scene from earlier in the script that plays out a bit differently in the film. When Peter is smoking his bong the night prior, the script describes a figure watching his window. In the film, the figure is clearly a cult member watching Peter from the treehouse. However, the script never specifies the location of the figure, and more importantly, we never see the figure exhale. It simply reads, "A wide of the house." In the foreground seems to be someone's shoulder. This could either be a cult member stopping to observe Peter as they are setting up Ellen's body, or this could be Ellen's body itself, staring out at the vessel she's intended Payman to enter. I could be reading too much into this, but I think it would make too much symbolic sense for Ellen's corpse to be facing Peter, so her dead eyes can watch as her meticulously laid plans fall into place. A moment that was cut from the film that doesn't relate to the cult but was nonetheless fascinating to me is when Peter locks himself in the bathroom during Charlie's wake and listens to the voicemail his mother sent him the night of Charlie's death.
Hi, sweetheart, it's Mom. Calling to make sure that you and Charlie are okay and having a good time at the barbecue. Alright. Have lots of fun and be safe. I love you both.
While I know this isn't a scene that affects the plot majorly, it still gives us a deeper insight into his guilt and trauma after Charlie's death. When Joan introduces herself to Annie, she writes down her phone number on a small piece of paper. A piece of paper onto which Annie later spills a bottle of paint, which instigates a meeting between the two women. Upon first viewing, I simply assumed Annie's hand knocked the paint over, but on repeat viewings, I noticed the familiar glint of light subtly sweep across the room and lightly brush the bottle of paint to tip it over. And while the script does not mention the light, it does make it clear that Annie's hand does not physically touch the bottle, meaning Payman's energy force is once again at play in this scene, moving the family around like pawns, convincing them to perform actions or make decisions they otherwise wouldn't have considered. When Peter smokes with his buddies under the bleachers in the film, there is a subtle indication that one of his friends has actually spiked the weed with an herb containing ritualistic properties. There are a few reasons for this theory. The first is that Peter's friend can be seen in the treehouse at the end of the film worshipping Payman with the rest of the cult. And the second is that we see an herb used throughout the film, which is meant to make the victim more susceptible to possession. We see this in the scene where Joan spikes Annie's teen with it, and later on, Annie is possessed by Charlie and Payman's joint spirit during the family seance. At one point, we also see an image of Ellen feeding an infant Charlie baby formula with the black herbs mixed in. Unfortunately, the script does not mention anything of the sort during the smoking session, so this theory might not be true after all. But it's possible that Astor came up with the idea in the development process and later wrote it into the film. One of the most engaging scenes that didn't make it into the final product is a conversation between Steve and Annie right after she unleashes on Peter at the dinner table and storms off. They build on the themes of free will that are discussed throughout the film in the periphery, mostly in Peter's classroom. And while I understand why this scene was cut, I think it has some of the most compelling dialogue in the script and brings clarity to some of the themes explored throughout the film. Steve and Annie argue about the choices they've made to cope with the loss of their daughter. Steve tries to convince Annie that bickering with her son is not the right choice, and it's only going to dismantle the family, while Annie accuses Steve of choosing not to see how cold Peter has been. When Steve asserts that Peter isn't to blame for what happened, Annie incredulously asks if they should just chalk it up to an act of God. And while she says this in an unserious tone, she's actually right on the money with that assessment. But instead of God pulling the strings, it's a demon. Perhaps most intriguing is when we see Annie address Peter's lie about the party being a school barbecue, and his reaction to Charlie's death by leaving her body in the car and going right to his room. Steve asserts that Peter was still in shock, and eventually Annie blames herself for making Charlie go out with Peter. Steve caps off the conversation by illustrating what little control they all have over their lives, stating, "The ceiling could collapse on us right now, and who would we blame?" Following this scene, Steve visits his son's room, where he assures an emotionally fragile Peter that he is not to blame for the accident. Peter rejects this and claims that he himself should be dead in place of Charlie, And as he repeats that he's sorry for everything, Annie listens in from her room and whispers that she is also sorry before sobbing quietly.
I'm sorry.
I feel like these scenes, while they don't inform us of any cult activity, are insightful into the mindsets of all the characters, which was left a bit more ambiguous in the final cut. Maybe this dialogue felt too on the nose and Astor wanted all the themes of the film to be more covert, but this scene definitely fills in some gaps. In the film, Annie frantically claims to be some sort of spiritual medium, preceding the family seance. In the original script, there is actually a moment in which Joan explains in depth what a medium actually is, and these few lines shed light on another form of manipulation the cult, and more specifically Payman himself, has been utilizing on the family. Before initiating the ritual, Joni prefaces, "I told you, I'd been experiencing these sensations a long time before the medium. I just didn't know how to explain them." Then later on, during Annie's seance, she shouts, "I was seeing apparitions earlier, I just shook them off, but I shouldn't have." This explains exactly why Annie saw her mother's apparition earlier in the film. The cult was priming her into believing that she was some sort of medium and thus convincing her to perform the invocation ritual with her family. Payman will later use this trick a couple times on Peter to frighten him and make him more vulnerable or susceptible to his possession. Most notable is when Joan's apparition is trying to expel him from his body. Whether Joan is physically standing there outside his school is sort of a mystery, but I think the fact that Peter alone is the only person who could see him points to some sort of trickery on Payman's part. From here on, the changes are negligible, but nevertheless interesting. After smashing her miniatures, Annie finds that not only has Peter's head been removed, but more conspicuously, Annie's figurine has been moved to the attic and her gown is drenched in blood. This obviously foreshadows Annie's death, or the destruction of her vessel might be a better word for it, as Annie essentially dies when Steve bursts into flames, considering Payman has taken full control of her. Another small difference is that the cult wears these goofy red cloaks in the script, rather than just being naked, which is a change I'm personally all for. Astor probably realized while filming that the robes were a bit over the top, so he had everyone stripped down completely. And in the closing scene, before Joan reveals who inhabits Peter's body, Peter asks who he is in a voice of Charlie, similar to how Annie speaks in Charlie's voice during the seance scene. And finally, one small line from Joan's speech was cut. She asks Payman to give the cult knowledge of all secret things and all mysteries of the earth, which admittedly sounds kind of silly. But those were some of the most interesting changes of the film that I wanted to point out. Thanks for watching. I hope this video taught you something interesting about Hereditary. And if you have any theories of your own relating to the film, comment them below. I'd love to hear some new perspectives. Otherwise, Ripley and I will see you in the next one.